Hi everyone, my name is Una Atwater. Today I'm doing a presentation on Glenda Elizabeth Gilmore's book, Gender and Jim Crow, Women and the Politics of White Supremacy in North Carolina. So a quick introduction to the book. The time period focused here is from 1896 to 1920. I found that most of the events that Gilmore records are from 1900 to 1920, and this is the time when black men were being disenfranchised through the ratification of the 19th Amendment. And this takes place specifically in North Carolina, but of course, the effects of what people were doing in North Carolina had a much more widespread effect. So the main two purposes that I found for Gilmore writing this book were as follows. So one was to analyze the Jim Crow laws being challenged by black women who were fighting for change, and to highlight the black women who were trying to work with white women to bring about this progressive change. As an English major, an education major, I thought it was really interesting the approach that Gilmore took. So she goes about writing this by focusing on various components of the historical issues. As you can see in the table of contents, there are all these historical issues that are explored kind of in the chronological order that people would experience them. And also including anecdotal historical examples of what was being done in North Carolina. So mixing individuals' stories with the historical contextual facts of the time. So there were two highlighted figures that I found most interesting and relevant in the book. The first is Sarah Dudley Petty, and her story is followed throughout the text. She was an African-American woman, the daughter of slaves, who wrote in the late 1800s mostly, and she came from a long lineage of African-Americans who valued and passed down the ability to read, think, and lead. So basically the understanding I got from the book was that this was a family of very intelligent people who were stuck, in this time when, as an African-American, they really were not allowed to use, to put their intelligence to work for them. And specifically, Sarah Dudley Petty grappled with this idea of place, or the social classes, but also like where people belonged based on the intersectionality of their gender, their race, their education, their socioeconomic status. And so the quote that Gilmore starts the book with is, "Some would say that woman is good in her place. That reminds me of what some white people say of the Negro, that he is good in his place." So this is kind of the idea that Gilmore starts the book with, is Sarah Dudley Petty's main idea that she focuses on, that is carried on throughout the book. Here's a photograph of Sarah Dudley Petty from 1900. The other person who I thought was really interesting, her story kind of develops later because she was born 15 years after Sarah Dudley Petty, and that's Charlotte Hawkins Brown. She was also an African-American woman, and she was able to see more than Sarah Dudley Petty the fruits of their labor and the effects of their hard work. Because she, unlike Sarah Dudley Petty, lived to see the civil rights movement of the 1960s. So all of their hard work, all of their activism kind of erupting and coming to fruition, Sarah Dudley Petty got to see that. And she was an author and a teacher. So here's an image of her in her wedding dress in 1911. So the main ideas from the book, I kind of broke it up by chapter, and again, it's a very thick book, if you can see that, a very thick book, and so there are a lot of anecdotes and a lot of interwoven narratives that discuss what was going on at the time, but I couldn't get all of that into a short presentation. So I just broke down the main ideas that were most relevant to the historical context of the time. So I broke it down by chapters. So in each chapter, there was kind of an underlying main idea. So we started with Black women fighting for women's equality and trying to work alongside white women for their combined equity to rights. That's the book in general. Chapter 1 started with discussing how Black women were becoming more educated. They were graduating from college, and they were ready to become activists against racism and sexism. And also, in Chapter 2, we learn about how upper-class Black men were conforming to white definitions of manhood and encouraging poor Black men to also try to adhere to the good behavior that was expected of gentlemen. There was also a really interesting paradox, which I won't go into detail in, but if you get the book, you'll read it, talking about the paradox of lynching and the rape charges that Black men were facing. And it was interesting that they were acknowledging that, yes, the lynchings were wrong, and yes, the often false accusations of rape were wrong, and kind of the paradox that created for African American men. In the next chapter, we read about how the components of gender and politics interacted with one another under a white Democratic government in North Carolina. And then we learn how those new democratic laws and legislation were working to disenfranchise African American men and the women that tried to help alongside them to stop this. We learned that when African American men lost their rights, Black women stepped up to take on a greater role in the interracial public sphere by actually taking on a less political approach. They used kind of more of a domestic, behind-the-scenes approach to political activism. And then we see Black and white women coming together and working together in volunteer organizations and building networks that allowed them to share in the dialogue about their experiences and the issues that they faced. So again, kind of working behind the scenes together to explore the issues at hand. Then we learn about the 19th Amendment being ratified and Black women trying to vote. To me, this connected a lot with the other texts from class. And it was just interesting to me that it says women can vote and Black women were turned away from voting when they went to the voting polls, which is just crazy and horrifying. So sometimes they were not successful in voting. They were turned away, but sometimes, and for some time after, they were able to vote. And so it kind of talked about that, how there was no consistency and it really was left up to people's interpretation, as racist as that may be. And then they were turned away. So the main lenses that I saw at work here were gender theory, critical race theory, and subaltern studies. Gilmore herself says these are the lenses that she wrote through. And she also, again, I have the second edition, so there's a preface in it. And she talks a lot about reflecting on the book after having written it and published it. So she was saying that she was mostly influenced by the 1980s lenses in scholarship. This was written originally in the 1990s. And so these are the lenses that she was kind of throwing her hat in the ring of the discourse around. One interesting bit of critique that she says in her preface that she had was the focus on educated Black women and not working class Black women. And so Gilmore kind of gave the reasoning for it that, educated Black women were the voices that were recorded and the narratives that were published or at least written down during that time. And so she says, that's kind of the main reason why those voices are the ones heard in her book. And then she also reflects on how the book could have been improved. So finally, my main takeaways from reading the book were the intersectionality of gender and race, obviously from the title of the book and the title of this course. Also the central role of Black women during this time and the activism that they had kind of behind the scenes and also in the forefront. And finally, the progressivism that was starting to come to fruition in the South. So those were my the main ideas that were ping-ponging around my head as I read the book. It is a really good book, and it was, like I said, it was a little bit more engaging for me because it has those anecdotal pieces, so you're reading about real people in the grand scheme of history. So that's it. I hope that you enjoyed my presentation, and I hope that if you can get your hands on the book, you'll find it interesting and as insightful as I did. Bye.